Let me tell you what my deep research and basically vision is.
I hope there's Bigfoot. I don't think there is.
I'm not telling you nothing.
The aliens won't let it happen.
Happening now, breaking.
Bernie Sanders is angry.
Bears beats Battlestar Galactica.
What are the tips? Give me some tips on how to work with Wes Anderson.
Be ready to speak very fast and very clearly, because that's definitely one key thing.
I will only tell the truth.
Until you and 6 kids you barely know in wet bathing suits have surrounded 9 chimpanzees outside of a Wendy's. You probably really don't know yourself, okay?
Yep. And we back.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to your new favorite podcast and the best in political, sports, and paranormal news coverage. I'm your host, Wes Anderson, and this is In the Shed. This is episode 67, so whether you're back for more or finding us for the first time this week, hey, thanks for tuning in. It is early Friday morning, January 26th, and I'm in a shed in the backyard of my home in Alabama, just so I can hang out with you tools and talk about the latest headlines, stories, and rumors in the world of politics, sports, and the paranormal. Good morning and happy weekend, my people, my tools, my babies. I hope that you have had a good week. I have had a long week. Not a bad one. It hasn't been a bad week at all, but a long one. It's been a hard week. This week I've had the privilege of being with people who are in a hard time, who are going through difficult circumstances in their life. I've gotten to spend time with folks who are in the hospital, folks who are undergoing treatment for cancer, folks that are incredibly positive despite the difficult circumstances of their life. And it's been a privilege to get to be with them, and in an attempt to encourage them, and as it so often works out, actually they encourage me more than probably I encourage them. But it has been a long week, and it just kind of was a reminder that everybody is going through something. Whether we always recognize it or see it or know the story of others that are in our lives, everybody has their own stuff, their own difficulties, their own circumstances, their own fears and worries and anxieties. And I got on Twitter yesterday, was scrolling as I sipped my morning coffee toward the end of this long week, and I just was looking at trending topics on Twitter, and I realized it hit me that of all the topics trending on Twitter yesterday morning when I was scrolling, almost every single one of them was negative. Almost every single one of them was about some circumstance in the world that is not as it should be. Civil war was trending on a Thursday in America, and that's never good, okay? That's never good. And I think the only two things that were trending that weren't necessarily negative were like some K-pop things, and I mean, depending on your point of view, those might be negative also. But it was a lot of negative and a lot of bad news and a lot of worry. And I just, I did something I don't normally do. You know, on Twitter, I usually just kind of share funny things and wish people happy birthday and congratulations on their sobriety, and share what's coming up on the show and what's going on in the world of sports, and good articles that I have seen and want to pass along. I run some polls on there for our listeners. But I did something I don't normally do, and I put together a Twitter thread because it really got me thinking about the state of the world and our perspective and our view, especially in our country, the landscape politically, financially, economically, the issues that we face. And I want to share that with you this morning. This is what I wrote. Currently, we have a system that actively precludes anyone not from one of two parties from actually running for president. Both of these parties are insisting that their best candidate is a very flawed octogenarian that 70% of the country doesn't want. Both parties say that if we elect the other guy, our very democracy is at stake. Public servanthood has been replaced with career politicians worth millions of dollars who are better at trading stocks than any financial professional. 4 conglomerates own 2/3 of the S&P. Our national media is no longer made up of journalists who hold those in power to account, but content creators and opinion pundits who profit from stoking the fires of outrage and division. The stock market is in good shape, but the cost of living for the average person is untenable. Family homes are being bought at an alarming rate by corporations, with young families unable to afford to rent and unable to qualify to buy. We've outsourced nearly all of our manufacturing, including needed medicines, and government has yet to address pervasive issues that continue to plague our nation, like the fentanyl epidemic, immigration reform, homelessness, healthcare, gun violence, and crony capitalism. In fact, our government shows little interest in problem solving or working towards solutions together at all, instead scapegoating and othering the other side to protect their team and cling to power. Israel is at war. Russia and Ukraine are at war. Civil unrest rages in parts of Africa. Tension is increasing between China and Taiwan, and we're bombing Yemen in response to attacks on cargo ships by the Houthis. Our small businesses still have not recovered from the pandemic, with thousands closing forever, and companies are laying off thousands of employees despite record profits and huge bonuses for their top brass. People are struggling. That about sum it up? Maybe you are too. Yet there is reason for hope. We're more alike than we are different, and there is value even in our differences. Character is revealed in adversity, and there is still good character in our country and its people. You are not a lost cause. We are not a lost cause. We need each other now more than ever. Get to know your neighbors. Extend others grace. Turn off the news. Don't participate in the outrage machine. Refuse to demonize the other side, and instead demand that government work together for the betterment of our country and its people. Wish happy birthdays. Celebrate and support the sober. Give charitably. Reconnect with your family, your friends, and your God. Build community. Vote your conscience. Love your neighbor. It still works, and it still matters. It's the way out. It's us. My neighbor, wherever you are, whatever you're going through, I genuinely hope something good happens for you today. You matter. You have value. You are seen. And that's how I feel. There's so much that is not as it should be. There are so many problems, so much hardship, so much wrong with our society, with our culture, with our country, with the political landscape. There's so much division, so much outrage. But you don't have to live there. You don't have to be consumed by it. You don't have to replicate it. You have the ability to be a person of light in a world of dark. You have the ability to be a good neighbor, to refuse to demonize those that you disagree with, to build bridges instead of walls, to add chairs to your table, to love one another. And it still matters. And it's still possible. And it still makes a difference. And it's the only thing that's going to turn this stuff around. It's the only thing that's going to bring us back. It's the only thing that's going to give us the society that we want to have, that an overwhelming majority of us want to have. Is if we live this way. If we become the change that we want to see in the world. If we start with the person that we see in the mirror, and then we start with our home and our family, and we start with our neighborhood and our community, and we allow it to change and grow and spread from there outward. So it was a long week and it was a hard week, but there's reason for hope. There's still good in this world. I had missed a phone call the other day from friend of the show, Bigfoot Bob, my podcasting podfather, Robert Jesse Dominguez from Bigfoot Club that he does with his nephew Steven. Bob has been on this show before. He was my very first guest. I have been on Bob's show, the only podcast that I have been on as a guest. And I missed a call from him the other day. And then yesterday I was in the car line at the elementary school picking up my 7-year-old. And I had a moment, and I just wanted to give him a call back. I didn't know what was going on, if he just wanted to talk, if he had an idea or a critique of the show. And so I called him back, and he answered the phone, and he was just getting into work. He didn't have very long to talk, but I said, "Hey, Bob, what's going on, man? I saw I had missed a call from you. Finally getting a chance to call you back. Been a long week." And the only reason he had called was to tell me that he had just listened to the last episode of the show, and that he was proud of me, and that he just was so thankful that I was back doing episodes of the show, because for a long time I didn't. As I've shared on episode 64, the first episode of this year, for months after my Meemaw passed away, my grandmother, I didn't do any episodes of the show. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth and the energy necessary to prepare to come out here, even though this is something I enjoy, to come out here into my shed and to talk news with you guys. And so for several months, there was radio silence. And now that I'm back on and I'm back on my grind, I'm back in the shed. Bob wanted to call just to say, "I'm proud of you. I'm so glad that you're doing your show again. I'm so glad that you're back at it. I'm so glad that you're back on the horse." I've never met Bob in person. But he's always been so gracious to me and so kind. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what it takes. This is the type of community it takes for us to turn things around. To be a person of intentionality, a person of grace, a person that just cares about others. So I know some of you hearing this, you're going through your own stuff. You're facing your own difficulty, your own hardship, your own mountain that seems too big to climb. And if that's you today, if you're overwhelmed by the state of the world or of our country, if you're stuck in that outrage loop, I just want you to know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There is hope. There's reason to smile. There's laughter. There's people of good character. Our country is still a country of good character at heart. And we can't lose sight of it. And that's the type of person that we need to strive to be, all of us, together, my neighbor. So shout out to Bigfoot Bob, Robert Jesse Dominguez. Shout out to his show, Bigfoot Club. If you listen to any other podcast besides this one, go check him out. He's a good guy. He's a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. And I strive to be that as well. All right, enough of that. Let's get to some comments and corrections from our last show. On our last episode, I responded to an emailer that I hadn't seen it reported anywhere that the car that wrecked into President Biden's motorcade was an assassination attempt, and as it turns out, that was correct. The 46-year-old driver who ran into the motorcade was arrested and booked on a DUI. On episode 66, I said that Jeffrey Epstein had been given a $2 million townhouse in New York City. And in fact, Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works billionaire owner Leslie Wexner signed over the $77 million Manhattan townhouse to Mr. Epstein for $0. On last week's show, I said I didn't know where the phrase "more than we can shake a stick at" came from. As it turns out, it comes from shepherding. Yeah, it comes from shepherding. Shepherds would use a stick or a staff to control their sheep. And if they had too many sheep to be able to control, they had more than they could shake a stick at, apparently. On our last episode, I said that Georgia defeated FSU in a bowl game 66-3. In actuality, the score was 63-3. And finally, on our last episode, I continuously pronounced a rainforest in Washington State as the Ho Rainforest. It gets squatchy in the Ho. And it turns out that too was correct. The Ho is named after the Ho River, which flows from Mount Olympus down to the Pacific Ocean. Our humble little show is being listened to across the globe, 68 countries in total and counting. We are, of course, being listened to all over this great country of ours, all 50 states. But our popularity is slipping in India, and I'm concerned. I'm alarmed. I'm losing sleep over India. For the first time in a very long time, India makes up less than 40% of our listening audience, checking in at a paltry 39.4%. Where did you go, India? Where are you? What has happened to us? How can I restore our relationship? The UK has passed Canada, sliding into the number 3 spot. We are on fire over in the UK. Canada, is it because I called you America's top hat? Was I wrong? Should I have not done that? The rest of the top 10 looks the same, but I also want to give a special shout out to our 8 new listeners in Turkey this week. Merhaba, Turkey. We're currently averaging more listeners per episode than ever before. Still true thanks to you. We're adding followers over on X, closing in on 10,000 there. We are just almost to 10,000 followers on X. You can find us there at In the Shed 4. Please support the show by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you leave us a review this week, we'll give you a shout out on our show next week. Support us by sharing the show with a friend. Word of mouth is still how we grow. And by joining our membership club at patreon.com/intheshed4, you can donate as little as $1 or subscribe for exclusive content for as little as $4 a month. If you keep supporting the show, I'll keep bringing you the news. We've got a great show for you this morning, but first let's get to some listener emails. Our first email comes from Jade from Oregon, who writes, Wes, the story about the python in the trailer park was hilarious. I could barely believe it was real. Love the show. Keep it up. And hey, thank you, Jade. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you for writing into the show. Thank you for writing into the show something positive, something encouraging. A lot of the emails we get are not so encouraging. We get a lot of critiques, and that's okay. We'll read them on the air. We don't take ourselves too seriously. I am not easily offended, but I do appreciate the words of encouragement, Jade. Our next email comes from Mike from New York City, who says, Wes, what do you make of Nikki Haley? Does she have a chance to be the Republican nominee for president? No, Mike. Nikki Haley is barbecue chicken. She is done. She is finished. Finito. She got destroyed in the Iowa caucus. She was a lot closer in New Hampshire, but did not win there either, picking up a few delegates. Donald Trump is the nominee for the Republican Party. That's just the way that things are, the way that things are headed. And the only reason that she's staying in is to see if maybe Trump doesn't make it to the finish line. That's my opinion. I think that she's hanging around and trying to get some delegates just in case Donald Trump, if something happens with his very many indictments where he does not make it to the finish line, then perhaps she will be the next in line. That's what she's hoping. Her chances do not look good. Thank you for listening to the show, Mike, and for writing in. And finally, Tyson from Jackson, Mississippi writes, Wes, at best, you're pop news. At worst, you are a misinformation factory. And we're back to the negative, my babies. Tyson wanted to write in the show to say, hey, you're not a journalist. I say that on the show a lot, that I am, in fact, a journalist. Not because I am a journalist, but because you, the people on the internet, have confirmed and labeled me an independent journalist. At best, we are pop news. We do some of that for sure. At worst, we are a misinformation factory. Not a factory at all, Tyson. I'm in a shed in the backyard of my home in Alabama, hanging out with you tools. And I'm glad that you're one of us, Tyson. You're welcome here anytime, even if you don't enjoy the show. You at least listen to an episode, and for that I say thank you. That's all the listener emails this week. If you have any thoughts that you'd like to share, you can email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Again, that's intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. I might even read it on air, whether it's positive or not. All right, let's switch to this. Let's get to the news in the world of politics, and let's hit the headlines. Historic, all Republican governors back Texas as they stand up against the Fed's border invasion, writes InfoWars. 24 GOP legislators in Pennsylvania challenge Biden over voter registration executive order, reports the Epoch Times. Trump's push to deny Biden border victory aggravates lawmakers, says The Hill. From Axios, Florida House passes bill that would ban children under 16 from social media. And finally, were the Saudis right about the Houthis after all? And that question is posed by The Atlantic. Our first story in the world of politics this week: Chinese scientists experiment with fatal mutant COVID strain. Chinese scientists are experimenting with a mutant COVID strain that reportedly has a 100% mortality rate in mice, bringing back memories of 2020 and the start of the pandemic. The strain attacks the brains of mice engineered to reflect a similar genetic makeup to humans, and most mice live just 8 days after being infected. Researchers reported the mice lost weight, became sluggish, and adopted a hunched posture, with their eyes turning completely white the day before they died. Dr. Kristen England cautioned the study was small and the paper is a preprint, which means it has not yet been peer-reviewed. It's important that we do listen to the data coming out of China because they do a lot of research on coronaviruses. You don't say. England told News Nation, "Humanized mice are bred so their immune systems are similar to humans, but there are still some major differences." England added that the mice were modified significantly to have more ACE receptors, which COVID latches onto to get into cells. So it's really not human-like, she said. The biggest concern is what kind of research is being done with the strain and the possibility the virus could leak from the lab. Some have suggested that COVID-19 was itself the result of a lab leak due to lax security in China. Dr. Eileen Marty, an infectious disease doctor at Florida International University, said there is no need for alarm. And I don't know how she can say that, because I think that there might be reason for alarm. But what do I know? I'm just a guy in his shed, early in the morning on a Friday. I digress. The studies themselves, especially if they were all done in well-contained and appropriate laboratories, are very useful for helping us get ahead of natural changes such that we can produce appropriate monoclonal antibodies, different types of enzyme inhibitors like protease inhibitors, and even produce better vaccines ahead of time before there's a major problem if it happens spontaneously, she said. Marty said it would be critical for the global community to ensure everything is being done safely in China to contain the research to the lab. So, I love that the article says that some have suggested that COVID-19 originated from a lab leak in China. Because it wasn't very long ago where that suggestion, that mere suggestion, the possibility that that may have been where it originated, was labeled a conspiracy theory. We've covered the pandemic since the outset of it on this show. And at one time, there were 4 or 5 episodes of our show that on Spotify had a little bar at the top that Tyson would have been proud of, that labeled us as misinformation. A little bar at the top of the episode that said, learn about the coronavirus pandemic. Those bars aren't there anymore. And look, I've never claimed on this show to know things that I do not know. I read you the articles, I let you draw your own conclusions, I share my opinion with you, okay? But I think it's at least fair to say that it is a possibility, as the article states, that some believe that COVID-19 originated in a lab. Because there was a lab in Wuhan that was doing experimentations with coronavirus. There were workers at that lab that had become ill with symptoms that reflect the coronavirus. And it was a lab that had been in trouble for having lax protocol in the past, for violating protocol in the past. And I got to give a shout out to News Nation, Chris Cuomo on his show, regardless of what you think of him or whether you're a fan of that particular network. They have covered this story. And I'm not seeing it covered very widely. That's why we're covering it on this show. We don't give you the same talking points as every other news show. We try to bring you stuff that's not getting reported as much as it should be, or to at least bring it to you in a different way. And this is a big story. I don't know why this isn't being talked about every night on the nightly news. They're doing experiments on a strain of COVID that is 100% fatal in mice who have been genetically mutated to have immune systems that are as close to human as possible. And all of them die Within 8 days, all of them died. Their brain cells are killed. They lose weight, they shrivel up, and the fact that their eyes turn white, completely white, a day before they die is appalling and alarming and scary. And the article says it quotes a scientist, there's no need for alarm. Hey, I'm alarmed. They're like, well, as long as they follow protocol and they are safe, and this isn't even a level 4 lab where this is going on, this experimentation. It's happening in a laboratory that belongs to a hospital that's owned by the Chinese military, okay? The article says that the global community should do their best to ensure that protocol is being kept and that things are being done in a safe way. We have no control over that. The global community is not invited in when it comes to what's happening in China. We have no power over it. We have no influence. We have no ability to tell them what to do or what not to do to ensure that they're doing things in a way that is safe. And they make the argument that, studying this stuff is important because it helps us develop vaccines ahead of time. It helps us, you know what might be helpful? And I'm just spitballing here, but you know what might be helpful? Not experimenting, creating, or allowing strains of a disease to develop in a laboratory that are 100% fatal. That's just my take. That's my opinion, that maybe the most helpful thing would be not to be doing this type of experimentation, because you're creating things that don't exist in nature yet. And you're creating a situation where if this were to leak, if things were to happen, if this were to pass to human beings, we would be in a lot of trouble, and quickly. Why is this not being covered on the nightly news? Why aren't you seeing this in the New York Times? Why isn't this all over the news? Why haven't you heard anything about this from the World Health Organization, from Dr. Fauci, from the President of the United States? And what can we even do about it? We still don't even have confirmation how the pandemic started in the first place. China's not sharing information with us. And we can't make them. We can't force them. We have no say-so. Our hands are tied. Despite whatever articles I share when we get to the paranormal news, hey, this is the most terrifying news that you're going to hear on the show today. And the implications of it, the possibilities that could arise, the spider web of possible future realities is nothing short of terrifying. We're playing with fire. When you play with fire, you just might get burnt. But we're going to report about it on the show. We're going to keep our ear to the ground. We're going to let you know what's really going on in the world. What do you think? Is there actual benefit to this at all? Is this something that should be done? What can we do about it, and how would you like our government to respond? Email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you about this because it matters. It's important. Our next story in the world of politics: family speaks out after IDF fatally shoots U.S. teen in the West Bank. The United States has confirmed the death of a 17-year-old Palestinian-American, Tawfiq Ajaj, who was killed by Israeli gunfire on Friday in the West Bank. Israeli authorities have initiated an investigation into the incident, which has left the teenager's family devastated. News Nation conducted an exclusive interview with the victim's family, who expressed profound heartbreak and are struggling to comprehend the details surrounding the tragic incident. Maher Abdul-Jabbar, Tawfiq's cousin, said, "I woke up from a phone call saying that my cousin was murdered, and I was just in disbelief." Tawfiq, a Louisiana native, had moved to the West Bank last summer to complete his high school education. His family disclosed that the fatal incident occurred as he was driving back from the mountains near their village. According to them, he was shot by the Israeli military and succumbed to his injuries shortly after being transported to a nearby hospital. Reflecting on the loss, Jabbar lamented, "The good always die young, and that's a prime example of what happened to my cousin." Mohammed Salim, Tawfiq's great uncle, expressed deep sadness for the entire family, stating, "The sadness is covering us from all over." Israeli Defense Forces reported that an off-duty police officer and a civilian fired at a person suspected of throwing rocks in the area. The IDF soldier present at the scene allegedly fired at the Palestinian victim. The claim is currently under review, with the Israeli police launching an investigation into the incident. The U.S. State Department confirmed the death Friday and are actively seeking more information from the Israeli government to understand the circumstances surrounding the incident. National Security spokesman John Kirby expressed deep concern about the situation, but indicated a lack of further details at the time, stating, "It's definitely deeply concerning, but I'm afraid I don't have more information on that right now." Tawfiq has been preparing to start his senior year overseas with plans to return to New Orleans for college to study business. A vigil was held in the New Orleans area Saturday where he was a member of a local mosque. The Palestinian Health Ministry says 369 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. Most of the Palestinians were killed during shootouts in the West Bank that the Israeli military says began during operations to arrest Palestinian gunmen. In several documented instances, Israeli forces and settlers have killed Palestinians who witnesses report were not engaged in violence. So, this is a harrowing and tragic story. And it's certainly something that is newsworthy, that we need to know about, that we need to talk about, that needs to be something that our State Department gets to the bottom of. What happened in Israel on October the 7th, the terrorist attack by Hamas launched from Gaza into Israel, is reprehensible and more than unacceptable. It was dastardly. It was absolutely inhumane. And this is a situation, what's going on in the war between Israel and Hamas, that is certainly complicated and layered. We haven't addressed it on the show very much because it began before we started recording episodes again, and also because I'm not an expert on the situation. I don't know that I have any expertise to bring you that you're not already reading and hearing on your own, okay? Israel certainly has the right to defend themselves, and we know that there's collateral damage that happens when it comes to war. War is a messy thing that should be avoided at all costs if and when possible. However, it's also true that that does not mean that the IDF, that Israel is completely correct in all of the way that they handle these situations, that they're above reproach at all. And the unfortunate truth, the unfortunate and uncomfortable reality is that it may take something like this happening and being investigated and being covered and reported on for things to change and for the full truth of the situation to come to light. This was a young man who was born in Louisiana, grew up in Louisiana with his family. They are Palestinian-Americans. His parents took their children to the village in which they grew up in the West Bank, a small village, in order for them to get a sense of their culture, to be around family and friends. A village that normally there's not these things happening in the streets like they are right now during wartime. And this young man was headed from one property his family owned back to his home. And according to his father, he was executed. He was shot from behind by off-duty Israeli police forces. They allege that he was throwing rocks. There's no evidence that has been produced to show that he was, but hey, even if a 17-year-old threw a rock, it does not equate to him being murdered in the street. It doesn't make it okay. That's not an appropriate response, and these things are happening. And just like what happened on October the 7th is wrong and is not acceptable, neither is this type of behavior or retributive violence. It doesn't solve anything. And this IDF off-duty policemen, these soldiers, should be held to account. And John Kirby, do your job. This is an American citizen. This is not a militant. This is not a terrorist. This is a kid who was headed home. He hasn't been in the street protesting. He was headed home. I saw an interview with the kid's father, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. I can't even begin to put myself in his shoes to understand what he's facing, what he's going through, the level of overwhelming grief that he must be wading through and experiencing. This young man had a 7-year-old sister, and the father described how people began to gather outside of his home after his son's life was snuffed out. And the boy's younger sister just looked up at her dad and said, "What's happened to my brother? Where is he?" It's tragic. It's tragic, and it's not how things should be. Blood spilled in the streets of young ones is not helping to solve anything. not stopping any terrorists, not moving the needle toward peace. And I did see a few headlines about this, but most news shows just gave it a passing glance. And I think it's something that really needs to be thoroughly investigated. We need to get to the bottom of it, and the Biden administration should use the full force of their influence with the only Democratic ally that we have in that part of the world to say, hey, this stuff cannot happen. The father said that he's experienced being stopped by the IDF before, but he knows how to handle it. He has a special tag on his car that shows that he's an American. He lifts his passport out of the window. He gets out of the car carefully. He lets them know that he's just going home, that he's not causing problems. But this was a 17-year-old who doesn't know how to handle these situations. That's never been in one of these situations before. And when they went over to their homeland where the parents had grown up, all of this stuff was not going on. It's not like they took them into an active war zone. This stuff has spiraled out of control since they've been there. And this kid deserved to be able to go home to his family and to his siblings and to his mom and to his dad, and they never got to see him again. They didn't have the opportunity to watch him graduate high school, to watch him develop into the man that they've raised him to be. And it's absolutely gut-wrenching. And it's wrong, and it's tragic, and it's sad, and it's horrific that this even happened or occurred. And it's not just a mere misunderstanding. It's an act of retributive violence. It appears to be an act of retributive violence that is inhuman and disgusting and wrong and something that you need to know about. And I want to hear the Biden administration talk about it. I want to hear them name his name. I want to hear what steps they have taken to address the situation. There needs to be some way, even in this situation, that justice prevails. This young man's life was snuffed out needlessly. And this thing happens to folks who aren't American citizens, and we never hear about it because they aren't American citizens. It's unfortunate that we even are having to discuss it. But maybe something like this being in the news, this tragedy, will not go quietly into the night, but instead will cause things to be examined under the microscope of truth. This tragedy is one that can't be wasted. And it's certainly my hope that it leads to some type of change, that some good comes out of it, even as his family struggles to begin to deal with the hardship of their new reality. Our prayers go out to his family, to his mother, to his father. This is unacceptable and it cannot stand. Our next story in the world of politics: over 200 bodies found buried near Mississippi jail in predominantly black county, raising questions and calls for investigation. A gruesome revelation in Mississippi is alarming residents of the state and raising calls for an investigation. After over 200 bodies were buried near a local jail in a predominantly black county, questions are growing over who these people are, how they died, and how they ended up in bare graves behind the jail. The Chicago Crusader reported that the 215 people discovered buried in a pauper cemetery behind a jail in Hinds County make up a multi-ethnic group of people who are black, white, Hispanic, and Native American. These individuals lay buried in simple graves marked only with metal rods and numbers, even as some of their relatives searched for them or reported them missing. Reverend Hosea Hines, who leads Jackson's Christ Tabernacle Church and is the head of a New Day Coalition for Equity of Black America, has called for an investigation. It really saddens my heart to know that their relatives went that long, some over a year, not knowing if their loved ones were dead or alive, and then coming to the realization that they had been buried in a pauper's grave behind a jailhouse, Hines said. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump has joined Hines in seeking an investigation into the graves, arguing that it's unknown if racism, prejudice, or bigotry played a role in any of the deaths, the Crusader reported. According to the outlet, Crump said at a December news conference that people all across America are scratching their heads in disbelief about what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi with this pauper's graveyard, referring to the state's capital city, which is located in Hinds County. It went from talking about the water, Crump said, referring to the city's previous water crisis, to now we're talking about a graveyard. What is going on in Jackson, Mississippi? Mississippi authorities have been under scrutiny for their burial and notification policy since it was revealed that Dexter Wade was struck and killed by a police vehicle and buried without notifying his mother, who spent months looking for her son while authorities declined to tell her that he had died. A report about the case revealed that a second black man, Mario Moore, had been killed in a separate incident and buried on the same day and at the same location as Wade, again without his family being notified. The cases of Wade and Moore were part of a series of reports by NBC News on failures in the death notification system used by authorities. This report eventually led the news organization to obtain county coroner's records for Hinds County, which led to the identification of 215 people who had been buried in the Paupers Cemetery since 2016. The news network has published the names and basic identifying information of the 215 people in hopes that family members and the public can find their missing relatives or loved ones. Regardless of whether there's a larger investigation into the burials in Hinds County, the unceremonious disposal of hundreds of bodies demonstrates a callousness at best. With national public attention and scrutiny now being placed on the county, however, it may reform the system that has left so many people searching for answers about their loved one's fate. So, this is something that is happening not in the early 1950s, not in the 1800s, but in America in 2024. It's hard to fathom that something like this is even remotely possible. That this can even be reality. That there can even be a set of circumstances that lead to a situation where 215 people, human beings with families who care about them, and in many cases have been searching for them, did not even know that they had passed away, were buried in unmarked graves behind a prison in Mississippi. And this is why I started the show the way that I did today, because there is so much in the world of news that is alarming, like the COVID story, that is tragic, like the young Palestinian-American who lost his life unnecessarily, and like this story that is remarkably callous, that it's easy for us not to be hopeful. It's easy for us to only hear bad news, but hey, this is something that needs to be talked about and covered, and I did not see this get the coverage that it deserved. And we got to talk about how people who are incarcerated are treated in America. And on this show, we talk about the prison system and prison reform quite a bit because it matters. These are people who have made mistakes, people who have broken laws, who are being punished, but they're still human beings. They still have inherent worth because they are human beings. They still deserve to be treated in death with respect. Their families still deserve to know what happened to them, deserve the opportunity to claim their bodies and offer them a burial that is respectful and that contains dignity. And in this situation, officials at this prison in Mississippi, in this county, they violated people's rights and they stripped them of their dignity. And of course, there needs to be an investigation, but even more than that, people need to be held accountable. And there needs to be change. There needs to be reform. We need to pay closer attention to the way that those who are in positions of power and authority over others in our country behave and act and treat folks. The story of Mr. Wade, the young man who was hit by a police cruiser and died, and then buried in a pauper's grave, and his family wasn't even notified of what happened, is one of the more unfortunate and tragic and sad situations that has come across this news desk in a while. 215 human beings. And for so many of them, their family didn't even know what happened to them or where they were. What are you doing, Mississippi? What do you think gives you the right to make decisions about other people's sons and daughters and eternal resting places of those who have passed on? This is so out of whack. This is so beyond the pale. Something's got to be done about this. And it's happening in the county where the capital of the state resides. It's unbelievable. 215 human beings. And I know it's not pleasant to hear. I know that the news that we've shared with you is hard today. But each of these stories is something that matters, that should provoke change, that should provoke investigation, that we need to know about. Because as people, as citizens, we have to hold those in charge to account, those with power to account. It's the only way that things will be just and fair and right. And this situation was none of those things. And anyone involved who violated rights, who engaged in activity that is dastardly and criminal and tragic, should be held accountable. Legally should be held accountable. Professionally should be held accountable. Civilly should be held accountable. I read this on page 6 of a newspaper that I subscribe to. Didn't hear about it on cable news. Haven't heard about it from the national media. Read about it on page 6. As if these people don't have value. As if this is just a headline. These were mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. And again, it's tragic. And it's appalling. And something has to be done about it. Something has to be done about it. For our last story in the world of politics this week, we go to something completely different. And it is a hard transition, okay? But if you've listened to the show, you know that this is how we do things. We give you the news, we give it to you straight, and sometimes that means going from very tough stories to something a little lighter. And so we close on this note. House-proud mouse discovered tidying British man's shed every night. When retired postman Rodney Holbrook set up cameras to try to find out who was tidying up his shed almost every night, he found an unexpected helper scurrying around his workbench. The black and white night vision footage revealed that a tiny mouse was behind the mysterious tidying, helping moving objects left on the workbench into a box. At first, I noticed that some food that I was putting out for the birds was ending up in some old shoes I was storing in the shed. So I set up a camera to see what was going on. Holbrook, who lives in Bullish Wells, a small town in central Wales about 60 miles north of the capital city Cardiff, said in a statement. Footage from that camera captured the mouse carrying objects like screwdrivers, clothes pegs, or pieces of cable in its mouth and clambering into boxes almost as tall as itself. I couldn't believe it when I saw that the mouse was tidying up. He moved all sorts of things into the box, bits of plastic, nuts, and bolts, Holbrook said. I don't bother tidying up now as I see that he will do it, the man said. Some objects seem easier for the miniature Marie Kondo to move than others. A long cable proved especially challenging to fit inside the box. It really was amazing to see the footage. Some of the things that it tidies away are really unusual. I think he would tidy my wife away if I left her in there, Holbrook said. It's happened practically every night now for 2 months. Remarkably, this isn't the first time that Holbrook has encountered a house-proud mouse. He told the BBC that he installed a night vision camera for a friend in 2019, which revealed another mouse keeping his friend's shed organized as well. So, this guy noticed that things in his shed, around his workbench, were being moved around and decided to put cameras up to see what was going on. And he had a mouse that was organizing his nuts and bolts and screwdrivers and putting his tools away neatly in a box. And hey, nobody in the world of news covers the animal kingdom like we do here on In the Shed with Wes Anderson. If there's something that is at all newsworthy from the world of the animal kingdom, you can bet your bottom dollar that you will hear about it on this show. And look, I need one of these mice in my shed. My shed needs some organizing. I could use some help. I ain't even mad at you, little mouse. Come in here. I need my own personal ratatouille. And rather than cooking me meals, I need you to organize my shed, okay? And I saw the footage. I watched the video. It is hysterical and remarkable and really neat. You should take a few minutes of your day-to-day and go watch that video. Look it up online. What are the odds that this one man in the UK has had this happen more than once? This wasn't the first time that he's caught a mouse on video organizing somebody's shed. And that's insane. That's wild. Literally wild. but it's a lot of fun, and it's a cool story. And I thought after sharing some very difficult ones, we could end our news in the world of politics on something lighter, something better, something odd. A mouse that's taking his time. While everybody else is asleep, this is the hardest working mouse in the business. He's taking the time to organize this man's shed, which apparently is his living quarters. And hey, I'll let you immigrate over here to America. This little mouse might be hearing this show. We're growing in the UK. He might be hearing this show, and if he is, you stow away on a cargo ship, okay? You work your way over to Alabama, and I got a very nice shed that you can live. I'll even give you some crackers and some cheese, all right, if you do some organizing while I'm asleep. And that's the news. All right, let's switch to this, the news in the world of sports, and let's hit the headlines. Falcons hire Raheem Morris as coach and pass on Bill Belichick. LeBron makes history with 20th All-Star selection. Patriots' Kayshon Boutte arrested over illegal betting while at LSU. Arizona football expects to hire Dino Babers as head coach. ACC unveils full 2024 football schedule. Steph Curry not an All-Star game starter. DePaul fires men's basketball coach Stubblefield after 3-15 start. Carolina Panthers hire Bucks offensive coordinator as new coach. And finally, Vic Fangio to become Eagles defensive coordinator. In the world of sports this week, let's first take a look at some SEC basketball. And here are your SEC standings. Currently, Alabama, Auburn, and Tennessee are at the top of the standings, followed by South Carolina, Kentucky, Georgia, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida, Texas A&M, Mississippi State, and Arkansas, with Vanderbilt and Missouri still winless in conference play. There are 3 ranked teams in the SEC, all in the top 10. Tennessee is number 5, Kentucky is 6th overall, and my Auburn Tigers are number 8. There are 7 to 8 teams who are safely in the tournament field at this time. And just the other night on Wednesday, I watched an incredible basketball game, a great atmosphere, as Alabama defeated Auburn at home in Coleman Coliseum 79-75. And the Iron Bowl of basketball being something that is worth watching is still new to me. Growing up, neither one of these teams were very good very often. And this is certainly a state that cares much more about football. Basketball is my favorite sport. I love the way they dribble up and down the court. I keep it so fresh on this microphone. Okay, I'm done. But it's a lot of fun. Both teams have had complete regeneration of their programs and are reaching new heights. Alabama under head coach Nate Oates, Auburn under head coach Bruce Pearl. I was excited to see this game. Last year, Alabama swept Auburn, and Auburn had to travel to Alabama to play this game. Alabama shot the ball well from behind the three-point line. In the first half, Auburn dug themselves a hole, down 14 at the break, and the difference was really 2 things. Auburn shot 5 of 25 from behind the three-point arc, and they got very little from their starting point guard, 5-star freshman Aiden Holloway, or from who I think is their best player forward, Jalen Williams. Auburn continued to switch on defense. It's how Bruce Pearl likes to call things. But there was an easy adjustment that could have been made, because too many times Alabama's best player, their point guard Mark Sears, had matchups that were advantageous to him because of the switching defense of Auburn. On several occasions, he would call for a screen. Auburn would switch, and then the quickness of Sears off the dribble against one of Auburn's 4 or 5 men resulted in a basket, and I just don't understand why at no point did they call out the screens, fight over them, and refuse to switch and stay on your man. It's an easy adjustment, but it continued to plague Auburn throughout the game. Auburn's defense at least allowed them to make a game of it in the second half. It was close down the stretch, but Alabama pulled it out 79-75 to win their 3rd game in a row against the Auburn Tigers, my Auburn Tigers. And I sure would have liked for us to win that game. I sure would have been happy to receive that road victory. But Auburn is still 16-3 on the year. They still have the better head coach in that matchup. They have the better roster, and they have the higher ceiling. And in my estimation, they are the 3rd best team in the league, behind Tennessee and Kentucky, who have a level of depth and talent and defense that puts them at the top of the SEC. Every year on this show, when college basketball season kicks off, we give you 4 teams to watch, and Auburn is one of those teams. They did not have their best game, but I still look for them to bounce back and to be towards the top of the SEC standings as the year moves on. Alabama has an opportunity to climb from the middle of those standings and to remain at the top as well. They're 13-6 on the year. But it was certainly an incredible atmosphere and a fun game to watch, and as of now, that is where things stand when it comes to SEC basketball. For our next story in the world of sports, I want to look at some key coaching changes that have taken place. On our last episode, we talked about the GOAT, Nick Saban, retiring as head football coach at the University of Alabama after 17 years and unmatched success that we will probably never see again in the sport. And I gave you a list of candidates that I expected to be considered for the job. And they hired someone that was not on that list at all. I gave you a list of 12 coaches who I thought would be considered. I put them in tiers of who was most likely down to who was least likely. And Alabama hired instead Kalen DeBoer, who was the head coach at Washington. DeBoer, which of course is Spanish for the pig. I made that joke to some of my Alabama fan friends, and they did not find it very humorous. And look, Kalen DeBoer is a good football coach, there's no doubt. What he does with an offense and X's and O's and the way that he maximizes talent and puts his offense in a position to be successful is admirable. But I didn't have him on my list at all because I could not fathom, after Nick Saban retiring, Alabama hiring someone that has no coaching experience in the SEC and no ties to the program at all whatsoever. It was a surprise to me. He was not on my big board. I think that the response from Alabama fans, as I've seen it, has been somewhat mixed, although mostly positive and hopeful. I don't know who would want to take a job following the greatest person to ever do the job. It's a difficult circumstance and situation, and Kalen DeBoer must be a very confident human being to be able to take that job, especially when Nick Saban will still have an office in the football complex. I think that this is a fairly good hire. It remains to be seen if Kalen DeBoer can recruit at the level that Alabama is used to. He does not have relationships built in this part of the country. In the jobs that he's been at before, he hasn't had to recruit at an elite level to be successful. And he's going to have to at Alabama. If Alabama loses 2 games, their fans consider it a failure of a season. If they're not in the college football playoffs, it is a failure of a season. So expectations for Kalen DeBoer, Alabama, will be higher than he's ever experienced. And he only has 4 years of head coaching experience, so it is kind of a surprising hire, even though this guy just appeared in the national championship game against Jim Harbaugh in Michigan. When he was hired, 30 players from Alabama have entered the transfer portal, including 5-star quarterback freshmen. Several of those players have gone to Ohio State, a couple to Georgia. One went to Auburn, but he has already recovered from that initial shock a little bit by getting 5-star wide receiver Ryan Williams to recommit. That was a huge win for him and his program. And just yesterday he got a commitment from a 4-star defensive end that was going to Washington, who will now be joining him at Alabama. Kalen DeBoer, a surprising hire. DeBoer, which is Spanish for the pig. And we'll see how he does. It'll be interesting to keep up with that. Nick Saban out, Kalen DeBoer in at Alabama. At Michigan, Jim Harbaugh is out. He's been hired as head coach of the San Diego Chargers. And I got to say, I was a little bit surprised by this. Jim Harbaugh did what he said he came to Michigan to do. He said he came to win a championship. He came to return Michigan to the elite program that it's supposed to be in the world of college football, and he achieved that goal. Jim Harbaugh is a phenomenal college coach. He's been successful everywhere that he has been, and he finally had that thing up and rolling at Michigan, winning the national title this year, even amid controversy. And it's been rumored for years that Jim Harbaugh has wanted to get back to the NFL, that he wants to win a Super Bowl in addition to a college football championship. And now he'll have that opportunity. He's head coach of a Chargers team that has underperformed year after year, but that has some solid pieces, that has a franchise quarterback with a lot of talent in Justin Herbert. And Jim Harbaugh is known for working well with quarterbacks, for developing quarterbacks. It'll be interesting to see how successful he is in a tough division right away there in the NFL. And I don't know, maybe he left Michigan because of the investigations that are coming. Because all the controversy around sign stealing that happened under his watch at Michigan has not yet reached a crescendo. The NCAA is still investigating and could impose sanctions on the university. Maybe that had something to do with him getting out of Dodge. He graduated something like 28 or 30 players who either graduated or going pro. A lot of his team was changing over. But it's got to be a good day for Ryan Day. It's got to be a big day for that man who could not beat Jim Harbaugh the last couple of years, whose program started to slip, and look what happens. Jim Harbaugh leaves, and he gets some 5 stars from Alabama. He's having a good time right now, but he'll also have to produce this year. So Michigan has not hired a replacement yet with Jim Harbaugh out, but there are some key candidates to watch. The preeminent candidate and fan favorite is Michigan offensive coordinator Sherrone Moore. He filled in admirably when Jim Harbaugh was under suspension this year. Other names to watch are Brian Kelly from LSU, Lance Leopold from Kansas, Chris Kleeman from Kansas State, Elijah Drinkwitz from Missouri, Matt Campbell from Iowa State, and Baltimore Ravens offensive coordinator Todd Monken. So Jim Harbaugh, big game Jimmy, slip and fall Jimmy. He's now with the San Diego Chargers, and we'll see what happens at Michigan. There's been plenty of other changeover when it comes to head coaching positions in the NFL, with the Titans and the Panthers and the Patriots already naming their head coaches, along with the Raiders keeping their interim coach. And those are all situations where we will see how they play out. Those are relative unknowns when it comes to the coaching world, guys without a lot of head coaching experience. But the other head coaching change that I want to look at and talk about is in the NBA. Because the Milwaukee Bucks have let first-year coach Adrian Griffin go before the All-Star break. And instead, they've hired Doc Rivers. Adrian Griffin out, Doc Rivers in. And make no mistake about it, this is not a normal situation, okay? A team with top-tier talent like Chris Middleton, Damian Lillard, and Giannis Antetokounmpo, a veteran team that has designs on winning a championship that moved on from their coach that won a lot of games in Mike Budenholzer. A championship coach in Mike Budenholzer, to bring in Adrian Griffin. And then they let him go his first season before they even reached the All-Star break. It's odd. It's head-scratching. It's bizarre. There were obvious problems there when it comes between player and coach. I don't know if this was Giannis or Dame Lillard or both. I don't know if there were culture issues going on in Milwaukee. They've been in second or third place in the East all season long. They've looked like one of the top 3 teams in the East all season long, and yet they're moving on from Adrian Griffin to maximize their championship window. And to do so, they hired the doctor. They hired Doc Rivers. You want to win a championship and you hire Doc Rivers. Hey, don't think it's going to work. Be careful what you wish for. Not sure this is the way to go. Look, Doc Rivers is a good, solid, winning NBA basketball coach. But an expert tactician he is not. And he's lost a whole lot of Game 7s in the playoffs. He's coached teams that routinely could not quite get over the hump. He's coached teams that were a disappointment when it mattered most. And that's who the Bucks have turned to in their time of need. Adrian Griffin is out. Doc Rivers is in. I don't see it being that helpful. I don't think the Milwaukee Bucks are winning a championship this year. That's just me. What do you think? What do you say? What do you make of these notable coaching changes at Alabama, at Michigan, and with the Milwaukee Bucks? Who got it right? Who got it wrong? What was a good hire? Let me know. Email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Get at us on Twitter at intheshed4. I would love to hear from you. And for our last story in the world of sports this week, let's take a look at the NFL playoffs, where we are down to 4 teams. That's right, my babies. We're almost to the Super Bowl. And things have not quite played out like I expected. As you well know, I have the Baltimore Ravens winning the Super Bowl, but I had them playing the Los Angeles Rams. I expected the Rams to make a run, and they lost to the Detroit Lions, and I wasn't even mad, okay? I'm rooting for the Lions. They deserve some success. The city of Detroit deserves some success from any sports team, and I'm proud of them. I've gone 7-3 overall in my NFL predictions so far. In the AFC Championship game, we have the Baltimore Ravens versus the Kansas City Chiefs. The Ravens are 4-point favorites there. They have home field advantage, and this is an exceptional quarterback matchup between Lamar Jackson, who is going to be the NFL MVP, and Patrick Mahomes, who is the best in the game. Andy Reid is a tremendous coach, as well as John Harbaugh for the Ravens. But I see the difference here being the defense. The Ravens have an all-time good defense. They have a great defense. And I think with the problems that the Chiefs have had on offense and at receiver and at playmaking, I just don't think they have enough to get by the Ravens this year. I have the Ravens winning 27-14 and advancing to the Super Bowl. In the NFC Championship, it's the San Francisco 49ers versus the Detroit Lions. The 49ers have home field advantage and are 7-point favorites. And by all metrics, they win this game. The 49ers have been the best team in the NFC for most of the season. They have talent all over the football field. They have a head coach in Shanahan that can really design some offenses that score points and put his players in a position to be successful. But I'm going with Dan the Man Campbell, okay? We're fans of Dan Campbell on this show, as you well know. If it weren't for DeMeco Ryans, Dan Campbell would be your NFL Coach of the Year. He's built a winning culture in Detroit. He's done a phenomenal job. Jared Goff and Jahmyr Gibbs and company are electric on offense, and I'm calling for an upset. I'm calling for a road win. I have the Lions winning 27-24 to advance to the Super Bowl against the Ravens. Those are my predictions. I've been fairly accurate so far. We'll see how it goes in the NFC and AFC Championship. I have the Ravens winning, the Lions winning, those two meeting in the Super Bowl, and the Ravens taking home the championship. That's all the news this week in the world of sports. Let's switch to this, the news in the world of the paranormal, where our first story takes us to Alex Jones. That's right, my babies. For our first story in the world of paranormal news, we go to Alex Jones. Because he had comedian Jim Brewer in studio on his show, and he told this story.
I'm going to tell a story I haven't told, Jim Brewer, just because you told us. Okay. You want me to tell a story about the devil? Yeah, I want to hear this. All right, this is a true story. Okay. All right, we lived in a golf course in Rockwall on a lake, and they hadn't built houses on the last level up. We were up on a hill where they hadn't built houses up there yet. So they're building these houses up there. And I'm on drugs, not alcohol, marijuana, anything. Wasn't a big drug guy. I tried a few things here and there, and I'm just really thinking about the future and the way Satan approaches you. If it's the devil, but demons is different things, but it's pride. And I was having these visions of power and these great things I would do and these things. I'm like 14 years old, and I'm in my bed at night, like 10 o'clock, and I can't sleep, and I feel like I'm being tempted by the devil. So I go outside at night, I walk around the neighborhood, and I go up on top of one of these houses they're building right down the street, about 2 doors down. So here's my parents' house. Here they are building these new houses. And I go up and I climb up on the wood on top of the house they're building. So the scaffolding's up, the wood superstructure's there. And I'm sitting there, and the devil is like, just join me, and all your confusion will be over, and I will empower you, and you're going to get all this power, and it's going to be incredible. It's like this vision of pride. And I said, okay, devil, if you're real, take my hand. And I put my hand out in the dark on top of the house. I've been out for hours. It's like 2 a.m. now. And my father, running up the top of the house in his underwear, reaches his hand into mine and says, "No, God loves you." So he'd been woken up by this. The Holy Spirit runs out of the house, down the street in his underwear, old-fashioned white underwear. My dad climbs up like a gorilla, grabs my hand, and says, "No, Jesus is real. God loves you." Wow, that's true. That happened right at the satanic conversion point. Wow. That's how I know God's real. My dad never did that. He never watched me at night. He'd let me do whatever I wanted. I could leave, do whatever I wanted. I had jobs. Everything was like 10 years old. But that night, my dad literally woke up, ran out of the house, knew where I was. He didn't see me on some rooftop down the street. Literally like a gorilla, ran up the thing and grabbed my hand and said, "No, Jesus loves you." Literally, as my hand goes out to say, "Do you?" Literally, at the moment, he's like panting, exploding up the thing for the moment. I mean, that's God's real, man. That's a powerful moment.
So, yeah. Look, I know I'm going to get pushback just for including a story on this show told by Alex Jones. The point of the inclusion of this story is not a referendum on the man, the pundit, the belief system of Alex Jones, okay? But whatever you think of the guy, you have to admit that this is a wild story. One of our listeners sent me a clip of this story and said you should talk about this on the Paranormal News segment, and I listened to it, and I agreed. According to Alex Jones, when he was 14 years old, he was having visions of grandeur, climbed onto the scaffolding of a house that was not yet built, and reached his hand out to offer himself to the devil. And that's not a good idea, okay? I would not recommend offering yourself to the devil. But he says this is how he knows God is real, because he offered himself to the devil when he was in a time of tumult and a time of questioning in his youth. And instead, his father, who had been awoken in the middle of the night, reached out and took his hand instead. What do you make of this story? I'll tell you one thing that he said that is certainly true, and that is, as J. Cole says, that pride is the devil. That he comes to us with pride, convinces us to try and make much of ourselves at the expense of others. But what do you do with this story? Is it the ramblings of a crazy man? Is it a window into the supernatural and a part of the world that exists that we may not often give enough credence to or see? I do believe that we are spiritual beings. I do believe that there are things happening around us that we do not always pay attention to or are aware of. I don't know whether this is a truthful story. He was telling it after Jim Brewer shared some of his own spiritual experiences. Interesting conversation between Jim Brewer, the comedian, and Alex Jones. A wild story. And I would love to hear your opinion about it. Not necessarily about the man, about what he has said or done, or how you feel, but about this story. Email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Get at us on Twitter at intheshed4, and let me know what you think. From offering yourself to the devil, we go to the afterlife for our next story. See how we do transitions on this show? I am a professional. I feel like I dissolved, and it was just really nice, woman says after being clinically dead for 24 minutes. In the spring of 2023, Virginia resident Lauren Kennedy experienced a sudden cardiac arrest in her home, which resulted in her being clinically dead for 24 minutes, reported Newsweek. The 39-year-old woman had been on medication for epilepsy for years and suffered a grand mal seizure, which caused violent muscle contractions and loss of consciousness, and she stopped breathing. My husband was across the hall and heard me say, "Oh no," Kennedy said. He rushed in to find me unconscious on the floor. I had stopped breathing and turned blue. Her husband quickly called 911 and performed CPR for several minutes until emergency services arrived. In total, it took 24 minutes and 4 defibrillator shocks. That's a hard word to say. Defibrillator. I think I did it right. To restore her heartbeat. Later at the hospital, Kennedy tested positive for COVID-19 and was diagnosed with myocarditis, a condition that inflames the heart muscle and could hinder the heart's ability to pump blood. Kennedy said her medical team speculated that this could have led to her sudden cardiac arrest. Only 9 days later, she was released from the ICU. Naturally, the incident had been an impactful one for Kennedy, who, despite encountering death itself, has remained positive. When asked what it was like to be dead, she said, "I have this gut feeling that it was friendly and peaceful, even though I can't report any shapes or persons or visions of that time. I feel like I dissolved, and it was just really nice. What I have is a strong sensation of peace about the time when I was out of consciousness," she added. Kennedy's memory of her initial recovery is hazy, but by the time she was discharged from the hospital, she was declared cognitively intact with no visible brain damage on her MRI scans. She also exhibited a normal EEG despite her history of epileptic seizures. The experience has resulted in a change of perspective for Kennedy. "I remember a lot of very serene moments in and after the hospital, like none of the worries I used to have mattered, and I got insanely excited about things like cheeseburgers. Things just felt very simple," she said. "I feel like this is my second life. I feel like I have 2 birthdays. In my first life, I was very individualistic and strong. In this life, I have a completely different worldview, and I'm comfortable mostly with depending on others." At this point, she explained, "A lot of stuff like status and career success don't matter beyond survival needs, creature comforts, and helping others. I honestly feel like I'm here to love my husband and make life a little easier if I can for those I meet along my own path." She said that she now focuses on health and well-being, including silent prayer or meditation, and that she feels a calling to share her story. "I don't know why I'm here, or why any of us are here, but I know that we're all in this together," Kennedy said. "That's why I'm passionate about sharing my story, I guess. It's not just my story, it's the story of a lot of people." To that end, she released her memoir, Independence Ave, How Individualism Killed Me and My Community Brought Me Back, in November of 2023. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, are understandably significant to those who experience them and are often accompanied by a change in mindset following the event. The phenomenon 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 remains popular among those with an interest in parapsychology, and in 2021, Jeffrey Mishlove, PhD, won top prize in the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies Afterlife Evidence Contest for his presentation entitled Beyond the Brain, The Survival of Human Consciousness After Permanent Bodily Death. Mishlove's evidence included video snippets and testimonies regarding near-death experiences, reincarnation cases documented by memories of past lives, and 7 other types of evidence that consciousness survives physical death, according to a report from Mystery Wire. Mishlove received his PhD in parapsychology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1980, the only doctoral diploma in parapsychology ever awarded by an accredited university, and currently teaches the subject at the Holmes Institute for Ministries and Training with the Centers for Spiritual Living. Despite a number of scientific studies on the subject, complete with competing explanatory models ranging from the psychological to the neuroanatomical, no consensus has yet been reached to explain near-death experiences. So, you can explain this story however you would like. This show is a place for everyone. This shed is a place for everyone. We have listeners all over the spectrum when it comes to their beliefs and their philosophies of life, politically, what sports teams they root for, and their spiritual beliefs. Okay. But hey, this is a modern miracle. That's what this story is in my book. It is a modern miracle. This woman was dead, without life in her body, for 24 minutes. And she came back. And understandably, when she came back, she had more of an appreciation for life, a different perspective. This is something that we see all the time when it comes to near-death experiences. And hers isn't even a near-death experience. She was dead. Hers is an after-death experience. That's what they should call it, an after-death experience. She died, okay? And when she came back, she had a completely different perspective. No longer was it all about her. It's about what she can do for others, how she can help Prayer and meditation have become a part of her life now. And good for her. What an incredible story. Near-death experiences have been documented all over the world for quite some time. They're very interesting stories, and this one is no different. And I want to take a look at her book. I'm putting that one on the reading list because I feel like it would probably go very well. The message in that book would probably go very well with what I shared at the outset of this show about community and how we are to live. And this woman is living, and she's a living miracle. From the afterlife, we go to AI for our next story. AI can allow us to talk to the dead, but is that healthy? Late in his life, having already established himself as one of the most influential inventors of all time, Thomas Edison told an interviewer he was working on a new idea that would have blown all of his previous breakthroughs out of the water, a device that would allow the living to communicate with the dead. Edison's spirit phone never became a reality, of course, but nearly a century after his death, artificial intelligence is giving people a remarkably convincing substitute. A handful of new startups are taking advantage of AI's ability to mimic language, voice, and movements in order to resurrect the dead in the form of a digital avatar. These systems scan photos, messages, and recordings to compile an interactive version of a deceased person that the living can have realistic back-and-forth discussions with, either through a text-based chatbot, audio messages, or a simulated video call. The level of realism varies a lot depending on the depth of the data provided. The most basic options build a relatively crude facsimile using photos and emails. The more intensive versions use hours of video from interviews conducted with someone while they're still alive to produce what one company calls a high-fidelity version of them after they've passed. One of the most advanced digital afterlife companies, Hereafter AI, developed out of a chatbot that its co-founder built to mimic conversations with his father after he died of lung cancer. The head of one of the other leaders in the space, Storyfile, had his mother's avatar answer questions at her own funeral. And look, grief will make you do some crazy things, but having a digital avatar of your mother answer questions at her own funeral strikes me as bizarre behavior. That's just me. I feel like that's bizarre behavior. I digress. Simpler options have also become popular in China among parents who have lost children. Not surprisingly, many people are creeped out by the idea of so-called AI resurrection. But beyond the initial uncanniness of the whole experience, some experts in the psychology of grief say this new technology could prove to be quite harmful. You don't say. You don't say it could be quite harmful. You don't say. I digress. The number one concern is that these digital replicas could prevent mourning people from ever having to go through the difficult but crucial process of confronting their loss. Some experts also worry about the risk of having people in a deeply vulnerable condition relying on flawed AI systems, which have been known to lie, make things up, and even occasionally provide dangerous advice in processing their grief. There are also concerns about consent, since many people likely won't want to be replicated after they're dead, but have no way to stop the living from proceeding against their wishes. But testimonials from people who have used these services suggest that they can bring some much-needed comfort in difficult times, and at no point were they ever at risk of believing that the AI version was really their lost loved one. Some grief researchers add that AI can be just a modern extension of methods that humans have always used to process tragedy. They argue that speaking to a digital avatar is no different than well-established methods used by psychologists to help people come to terms with death, including things like having them talk to an empty chair or write a letter to the dead. As with so many things in this early era of AI, this technology is still in its infancy, meaning many of the benefits and pitfalls are only starting to be understood. A lot will depend on how rapidly the systems develop and whether they're ever capable of creating replicas that are truly indistinguishable from the real thing. No. No. 1,000 times no. Absolutely no. Definitely not. Not here, not now, not never, not me. It's a no from me, dog. Cue the meme of Michael Scott in response to Toby screaming no. I think this is a terrible, terrible idea, okay? Feel free to disagree with me if you want to, but hey, I have my own set of issues with AI to begin with. It's taken over the world. I do not think we should use AI to try and recreate the dead after they've passed. It just seems like a terrible idea from the jump. There was literally a Black Mirror episode about this. I mean, is that show starting to predict the future or what? And if you've ever watched the show, it's not a future that we want to become our reality, okay? I understand the desire to connect with those that we've lost. I understand the grief. I get the sentiment behind the idea. But I feel like this is a bad idea. If you want to write a letter, if you want to talk to somebody that has passed away that you loved as if they were there, hey, go for it. But trying to actually communicate with the dead, trying to recreate the dead, and using AI to do so does not strike me as a good idea. Does not strike me as a future that I want to be a part of. 1000% no. 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 And no. And if I were to find out that somebody did that to me after I passed away, let me be in heaven and find out one of my babies used AI to quote-unquote digitally resurrect me. I'm asking permission from the Lord to come down and haunt you. And it won't be pretty. It won't be pretty. From digital resurrection, we go to the Phenomenon of Stigmata for our last story this week. And I already did the song, so. People who have stigmata exhibit wounds that duplicate or represent those that Jesus is said to have endured during his crucifixion. The wounds that typically appear on the stigmatic's hands and feet, as from crucifixion spikes, and also sometimes on the side, as from a spear, and hairline, as from a crown of thorns. Along with possession and exorcism, stigmata often appears in horror films, and it's not difficult to see why. Bloody wounds that mysteriously and spontaneously open up are terrifying. However, stigmatics who are typically devout Roman Catholics do not see their affliction as a terrifying menace, but instead as a miraculous blessing, a sign that they've been specially chosen by God to suffer the same wounds his son did. Curiously, there are no known cases of stigmata from the first 1200 years after Jesus died. The first person said to suffer from stigmata was St. Francis of Assisi, and there have been about 36 others throughout history, most of them women. The most famous stigmatic in history was Francesco Forgione, better known as Padre Pio, or Pio of Pietrelcina. The most beloved Italian saint of the last century, Padre Pio, first began noticing red wounds appearing on his hands in 1910, and the phenomenon progressed until he experienced full stigmata in 1918 as he prayed in front of a crucifix in his monastery's chapel. Padre Pio was said to have been able to fly, and that's impressive because I've never known anyone who was able to fly. I've known a lot of people that love the Lord, okay. Never seen anybody fly, but apparently Padre Pio, and maybe it's Pio, but I'm just saying Pio because I don't know. Apparently he was able to fly. I digress. And also bilocate, meaning to be in two places at once. His stigmata was allegedly accompanied by a miraculous perfume. The Reverend Charles Mortimer Carty, in his 1963 biography of the saint, noted that it smelled of violets, lilies, roses, incense, or even fresh tobacco, and whenever anyone notices the perfume, it is a sign that God bestows some grace through the intercession of Padre Pio. Journalist Sergio Lozado, in his book Padre Pio, Miracles in Politics in a Secular Age, explains the social context in which Padre Pio's stigmata emerged. In the first years of the 20th century, when Padre Pio was a seminarian, the Eucharist, the body and blood of Christ, was at its height of its importance in Catholic practice. Communion was celebrated frequently and became a mass phenomenon. At the same time, asceticism was interpreted in ever more physical terms. Body language, ecstasy, levitation, the stigmata, was held to be the only real mystical language. Pio's stigmata appeared, Lozado argues, because that's exactly what the church and its followers expected to appear in its most devout servants. Jesus' real physical torment visited upon the holiest of men. Though Padre Pio was widely beloved, many weren't convinced that the friar's wounds were supernatural. Among the skeptics were two popes and the founder of Milan's Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, Agnostio Gemelli, who examined Padre Pio and concluded that the stigmatic was a self-mutilating psychopath. And that's quite a detour from flying holy man to self-mutilating psychopath. Let's continue. Still, Padre Pio garnered a widespread following and was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 2002. Though Pio, who died in 1968, never confessed to faking his stigmata, questions about his honesty surfaced when it was revealed that he had copied his writings about his experiences from an early stigmatic named Gemma Galgani. He claimed ignorance of Galgani's work and could not explain how his alleged personal experience had been published verbatim decades earlier by someone else. Perhaps, he suggested, it was a miracle. And perhaps, but also perhaps not. So is stigmata real or a hoax or something in between? The claimed miracle of stigmata, like Enidia, where people who claim not to eat food, never heard of that one, is very difficult to scientifically verify. Veteran researcher James Randi, in his Encyclopedia of Claims, Frauds, and Hoaxes of the Occult and Supernatural, notes that since 24-hour-a-day surveillance would be necessary to establish the validity of these phenomenon as miracles, no cases of stigmata exist that can be said to be free of suspicion. And though the possibility of genuine stigmata can never be ruled out, it is interesting to note that in all such cases the wounds in the hands appear at the palms, which agrees with religious paintings, but not with the actualities of crucifixion. The wound should appear at the wrists. If stigmata is real, there's no medical or scientific explanation for it. Wounds do not suddenly and spontaneously appear on people's bodies for no reason. Some specific instrument, such as a knife, a tooth, or a bullet, can always be identified as causing the trauma. Without a medical examination, it is impossible to distinguish a minor but bloody surface wound, which could be easily faked or self-inflicted, from a genuine and serious puncture wound identical to that caused by a Roman-era crucifixion spike. X-rays which could definitively determine whether a wound is superficial or truly pierces a limb have never been done on stigmatics. There are no documentary photographs, films, or videos of wounds appearing and beginning to bleed. Instead, the evidence for the existence of stigmata comes from eyewitnesses who see wounds that are already bleeding and whose origin explanation must be taken on faith. It is, of course, considered highly disrespectful to challenge the honesty and integrity of a person who claims and appears to be suffering from Christ's wounds. Stigmatics appear to be sincere and almost certainly often are in at least some pain, even if a wound is superficial. It takes a brave skeptic to accuse a beloved friar of fraud or faking the wounds, even if that's what the evidence clearly suggests. The fact that many of the faithful take comfort and inspiration from the teaching of stigmatics also serves as a deterrent from raising too many questions. Even those with legitimate suspicions may prefer to remain silent if it helps spread the gospel and serves a larger purpose. Until a person suffering from stigmata allows himself or herself to be subjected to close medical scientific investigation, the phenomenon will remain a myth. And I just have to point out the incredible stroke of irony that Padre Pio's last name was Forgione. The man who some expected of faking Stigmata's last name, who has been canonized as a saint, his last name, they suspected him of forgery, and his last name was Forgione. I couldn't write that better if I tried. Look, I don't know what to make of this. It's certainly something that is interesting to me. And this guy was canonized by Pope John Paul II. He's looked to as a saint, even though there are some questions here. His story matches up word for word with a stigmatic story that had been written a long time before him. He says he was unaware it was a miracle. Who knows? Who knows? There's been several documented cases of this. It is a phenomenon that a lot of Roman Catholics swear by. They say that it is a sign that someone is so close to Christ that they start showing physical resemblances to the wounds that he had while he was being crucified. Now, the article did make an interesting point. The stigmata, often the stigmatists, their hands are where the wounds from crucifixion spikes show up, and how that matches up with paintings. But we have since learned that in all actuality, those who were being crucified were nailed through their wrists because their hands were not strong enough to hold them to a cross. That's an interesting factoid. I don't know. I wouldn't say this is something that I would completely rule out as impossible or never having happened. But I also have a lot of questions, and certainly a lot of questions when it comes to Padre Pio and his story. What do you think? Is stigmata something that really happens, and if so, what is the purpose of it? Is it a sign of holiness and closeness to Christ? Is it a hoax? Is it something made up? Is it nothing more than self-harm from people who want to feel important? The views about this are all over the place, from those who are practicing Catholics, from those who are people of faith, from those who are not. But it's a phenomenon that a lot of people have claimed to have seen or experienced, researched, or known about. Do you think it's real? Do you put any validity to these claims and these stories? Email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Get at us on Twitter at intheshed4, and let us know what you think about the phenomenon of stigmata. That's all for this week. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. I can't either. It's back in the house and out of the shed for me. Thanks again for listening to episode 67. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, and review. It really does help. If you have any paranormal experiences, opinions about sports, or politics that you'd like to share, you can email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Again, that's intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. I might even read it on air. Join our membership club at patreon.com/intheshed4. Look for us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Pandora, the Good Pods app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to follow us on X at InTheShed4. Tune in again next week when we'll hit the headlines, talk some sports, and learn together about the man who was abducted by Bigfoot. This has been In the Shed with Wes Anderson, the best news show in the land covering politics, sports, and the paranormal. Have an adventurous and fulfilling weekend. I'll catch you tools later. Peace out, Boy Scout. And from the bottom of my heart, Meemaw, we made it!
We sure did.